A young woman faces betrayal from her own family, leading to the sudden loss of her job and home. Left with nothing, she struggles to survive, forced into low-paying, under-the-table work. As she navigates the harsh reality of her new life, she reflects on the years of manipulation and cruelty she endured. With every hardship, her determination hardens, and she begins to plan her future with a new, sharper purpose. The desire for justice fuels her, pushing her beyond mere survival. What starts as desperation soon turns into a calculated path toward reclaiming her power. I remember the exact moment my world collapsed. It was a Wednesday evening, and I was sitting at the family dining table, trying to swallow my panic along with a piece of stale bread. My sister Patricia kept smirking in my direction, and my father wouldn't even look at me. He just stared at the TV screen like I didn't exist. I just lost my job, an event they had orchestrated behind my back, and I was desperate for comfort or at least a shred of empathy. Instead, I got that hateful smirk. My father cleared his throat, paused the show, and dropped the final hammer with all eyes on me. "You know," he said in a clipped voice, "Patricia told me about your gross incompetence at work. It's bad enough you're living here like a freeloader, but now you can't even keep a basic office job?" I stared at him, my eyes burning. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him the real story, that Patricia had started rumors that I was stealing office supplies, that she'd whispered to my boss that I was unreliable because I supposedly drank on my lunch breaks. Lies. All of it. But my father had always believed Patricia over me. Patricia was the golden child. She was the one who'd gotten scholarships, got married at 22, and divorced a year later but still managed to come out squeaky clean in the family narrative. Meanwhile, I was the constant disappointment, apparently incapable of meeting their standards. The heartbreak and fury lodged in my throat like a piece of shrapnel. I still remember her vicious little laugh when I tried to defend myself. "Oh, come on, Dad," she said, swirling a glass of wine in her hand. "We all know Mary is great at blaming other people for her mistakes. She's lucky you let her stay here. Sometimes you're too lenient." My father nodded in agreement while my stomach twisted into knots. That night, I packed my bags and left, vowing that one day, I would make them see the truth. The humiliation was excruciating. I was jobless, living under their roof after my fiancé had left me 2 months prior for another woman. And now, they'd collectively destroyed my chance at financial independence by sabotaging the position I'd finally secured. They knew I had nowhere else to go. No backup plan. My savings had gone toward an emergency medical bill after I'd fractured my wrist, and the rest was eaten away by day-to-day living. But the final blow was when my father shoved a wad of paper into my hands. It was an eviction notice, drawn up by a family friend who was a lawyer. "Pack your things," he said coldly. "I want you out by the weekend. I've had enough." Patricia was practically vibrating with glee. That was the moment the back of my neck burned. That was the moment I realized I'd lost everything that once felt stable in my life. My father left the table, and Patricia followed him, their footsteps echoing in the hallway, leaving me alone with that humiliating piece of paper. My vision blurred with tears, but in my chest, a molten anger started to grow. I couldn't believe my own father and my own sister would do something so vile. Who kicks someone out just as they've lost their job? What father stands by while your sister robs you of your livelihood? It felt like a bullet to the heart. But somewhere beneath the heartbreak, a quiet voice in my head whispered, "Enough." I stumbled from the table, tears streaming down my face, and locked myself in the tiny guest room they had relegated me to. I collapsed onto the creaky twin bed, hands shaking as I read over the eviction notice again and again. Apparently, they had even set it up so that if I wasn't gone by Sunday, they would legally remove my possessions. My father's signature glared at me from the bottom of the page. And in the signature box for a witness, there was Patricia's neat, looping handwriting. My mind reeled. How had it come to this? A year before, I had been engaged, planning a modest wedding with a fiancé I thought loved me unconditionally. My father had seemed proud enough, and my sister had offered to help with wedding arrangements, but somehow, she'd always be there to add a negative spin. "Oh, you're serving that at the reception? That's kind of cheap, don't you think? Or, you're inviting your college friend? She's so trashy. Are you sure that's a good idea?" She'd roll her eyes when I wasn't looking or slip suggestions to my fiancé that made me seem like I wasn't good enough for him. And in the end, he listened. He left me for someone else, someone Patricia had introduced him to, and now, here I was, thrown away again. But as I sat in that tiny guest room, staring at the eviction notice, the humiliation turned into something else. Something sharper. Colder. I wouldn't let them win. About upgrading me in terms of how I dressed or acted, little barbs, day after day. Then, 2 months before the wedding, my fiancé fell for some coworker, ghosted me for a week, and then texted me that it was over. My father's expression at that time was disappointment, and I'd accepted that because it felt better than pity. But when I needed a place to stay, he said yes, and I thought maybe, just maybe, this was my chance to start over with a shred of familial support. Only it wasn't support. It was them taking advantage of me, making me feel like a burden until they found the perfect moment to throw me out like trash. With that humiliating last strike, sabotage at my new job, I had no illusions. That night, I was alone, sobbing in the dark, my phone lighting up with messages from old friends I'd lost contact with, plus spam calls, plus job rejections. Rage coiled inside me like a living beast, but also a fierce determination. I thought, I will not let them see me beg. I will not let them watch me shatter. So I took a deep breath, found a cheap motel online with my last scraps of money, and I stuffed my clothes and a few personal items into 2 battered suitcases. By dawn, I was gone, quietly slipping out the front door, leaving behind their hateful little notes, their mocking whispers. I'd never felt so worthless. But at the same time, I felt awake for the first time in my life. The next few weeks were borderline hell. The motel was infested with roaches, and the manager was a creep who kept asking me out. I had to ration my meals, often eating a single slice of pizza for dinner or skipping meals entirely just to stretch my funds until I could figure out what to do next. The irony was that I used to daydream about having a supportive family when I was a kid. Instead, I got a father who only cared about my value if I was successful on his terms and a sister who thrived on my failures. I'd do anything not to prove them right. I decided then and there, I am going to rise again. But this time, I won't be naive enough to let them see me coming. I started taking odd jobs, anything that paid under the table because my references were all shot. Patricia had made sure of that. She told my previous employer that I was a thief, so my last job gave me a no rehire notice. I was a waitress in a sketchy diner. I cleaned houses for cash. I even handed out flyers for a local pawn shop on street corners. It was humiliating, but it put a little money in my pocket, and every single dollar I earned felt like a step toward freedom. I'd spend my nights in the motel, crying sometimes, raging other times, but also plotting. I kept a journal of every slight, every betrayal, every humiliating moment. Not just from recent events, but from my entire life with them. The time Patricia told my high school crush lies about me. The time my father humiliated me in front of his business associates for not dressing properly. The time they convinced me to invest in a shady family venture, only for them to funnel the profits solely back to themselves. Page after page of heartbreak. But behind each heartbreak, there was a lesson. And behind each lesson, there was a spark. I needed a plan. Something bigger than just building a new life. I wanted revenge. Not petty or impulsive, but something grand. Something epic. The more I wrote, the clearer it became. I wanted them to feel the agony of public failure. I wanted them to taste that helpless, sinking feeling of having everything slip from their grasp, because that's exactly what they did to me. After 2 months of scraping by at the motel, I managed to secure a tiny studio apartment in a not-so-great part of town. It wasn't much, but it had a functional lock and no roaches crawling on my face at night, so it felt like paradise in comparison. I put up a single poster of a sunrise, something cheap from the thrift store, on the wall. And sometimes I'd just stare at it, reminding myself that every morning was a new chance. A step closer to the reckoning I was planning. I'd stare at it, imagining the day I would finally get to see their smug faces collapse in shock. I'd replay that fantasy to keep myself motivated through the day's grind. At some point, I realized that hiding away in low-end jobs wasn't enough. I needed a real income stream that could fund the kind of revenge I was envisioning. So, I started tapping into an old passion of mine, writing. Ever since I was a kid, I loved weaving stories. I'd keep diaries, draft short. I'd stare at it, imagining the day I would finally get to see their smug faces collapse in shock. I'd replay that fantasy to keep myself motivated through the day's grind. At some point, I realized that hiding away in low-end jobs wasn't enough. I needed a real income stream that could fund the kind of revenge I was envisioning. So, I started tapping into an old passion of mine, writing. Ever since I was a kid, I loved weaving stories. I'd keep diaries, draft short stories, even write a handful of poems. It had always been a distant dream to be published, but I never had the confidence. My father's voice was always in my head, saying, writing is a hobby for airheads. Get a real job. Now that everything else had been stripped away, I thought, why not? At night, when I came home exhausted, I'd fire up a second-hand laptop I'd bought with my tips, and I'd just write. Sometimes I wrote about families with unconditional love, everything I didn't have. Other times, I wrote gritty revenge plots that mirrored my own fantasies. Words poured out of me like they'd been pent up for years. I started posting these stories on a small online platform under a pseudonym, Nova Frost. At first, it was just a way to vent, but to my shock, people started reading. They left encouraging comments. They said they related to my protagonist's rage, the sense of betrayal, the longing for justice. Slowly, my follower count grew. I'd get messages saying my stories kept them hooked, that they'd never read anything so raw. That feedback ignited me further. I poured myself into a full-length novel, my biggest project yet, a revenge story set in a twisted family dynamic. It was partly fiction, partly drawn from my own life. I changed names, of course, and made the setting different enough that no one would connect the dots easily. But the emotions were real, the bitterness, the heartbreak, the desire for a show-stopping moment of triumph. When I typed, "the end," after months of nocturnal writing, I felt a jolt of electricity run through me. This was it. This was powerful. I decided to self-publish online because I doubted I'd find a traditional publisher quickly, and I needed the anonymity. I was terrified someone in my real life might discover it was me if I used a traditional route. Within 3 weeks of launching the ebook, sales started trickling in, then snowballing. Reviews poured in about how Nova Frost wrote with a ferocity that left readers breathless. People were recommending it to their friends. My book soared to the top of a certain digital platform's drama and suspense category. It was surreal. Suddenly, I was making actual money from my words, enough to pay my rent comfortably, enough to start saving. And as the money started building, a new plan formed in my mind, something bigger than just writing. My father and sister, Patricia, had always used wealth and property as instruments of power. They flaunted money, they used houses as bargaining chips, they mocked me for never being able to afford anything. Now, with this growing income, I saw an opportunity. Quietly, behind the pseudonym, I started funneling my earnings into different accounts, investing in low-risk options to keep building a war chest. Every time I got a royalty check, I'd stash a chunk of it away for living expenses, and the rest went into this revenge fund. The day my novel hit a major bestsellers list in ebook format was the day I realized I was unstoppable if I stayed invisible. I still did the menial jobs as a cover, waitressing, housecleaning, so no one in my old circle had a clue. But behind the scenes, Nova Frost was becoming a name. I even got approached by a literary agent who was convinced they could turn my story into a phenomenon. She had no idea who I really was. Through carefully orchestrated phone calls and email addresses that concealed my identity, I agreed to partner with her under the condition of absolute privacy. She was intrigued by the mystique. I told her I'd be sending all materials electronically, I'd only show up to events in a disguised manner, and I wanted no photos published without my consent. It was odd, but the publishing world loves a good mystery author. The next surge came when a small production company bought the option to adapt my novel. That check was beyond anything I'd ever seen in my life. I remember holding it in my trembling hands, thinking, they're not going to see this coming. I used some of that money for a better apartment, still modest, but at least in a safer neighborhood, and the rest went right into the fund. Then, I started searching for the perfect property to buy, something that would directly impact my father and sister. Sure enough, I discovered a piece of commercial real estate in our old neighborhood, a building that housed several offices, including a new startup my sister, Patricia, was rumored to be a partner in. The property was big, the price was intimidating, but with the right financing, I could do it. I will never forget the day the sale went through and I legally became the owner of that entire building. I felt giddy imagining how Patricia would react if she ever found out. But she wouldn't, because I did it all through an LLC that had no trace of my real name. I was the ghost pulling the strings. And I made sure to remain the perfect landlord, on paper, at least. I had the building management keep everything professional, quietly receiving rent checks, making sure I was an attentive yet anonymous property owner. My sister had no clue her monthly payments were going straight to me. She was busy bragging to her friends about her new entrepreneurial endeavor, certain I was probably homeless somewhere or waiting for peanuts, but I wasn't satisfied yet. My father and sister had publicly humiliated me. My father had kicked me out in front of other relatives, brandishing that eviction notice like a trophy, and Patricia had orchestrated my job sabotage so brazenly I wanted them to feel that same sting of being exposed, of seeing all eyes on them. They realized they lost to the one they deemed worthless, so I bided my time. I refined my plan. The publishing house invited me to a big reveal party, an event celebrating the success of multiple new authors, plus a special announcement from Nova Frost. They wanted the real person behind the pseudonym to show up, as it would be a massive publicity stunt to boost sales and interest. I was nervous, but it was too perfect to pass up. I learned that my sister's company had somehow found its way into co-sponsoring part of the event, likely by chance. She was probably just excited to rub shoulders with big names, never suspecting the big name was me. The event was set at a swanky downtown hotel with floor-to-ceiling windows, sparkling chandeliers, and a line of paparazzi outside. My father had apparently also been invited as one of the local business figures who might want to invest in the next wave of publishing. The irony was so thick I could taste it. This was the stage one needed. The night of the gala, I arrived in a sleek black gown, nothing overly flashy but enough to make a statement. I wore my hair differently than usual, styled in a sophisticated updo, and I had professional makeup done to ensure no one would recognize me on sight. My heart was pounding in my chest like a war drum. All around me I saw people in tuxedos and cocktail dresses sipping champagne, scanning the crowd for celebrities. My father was there, laughing boisterously with some suit-wearing cronies, while my sister stood near a branded booth for her company, wine glass in hand, looking bored. If she noticed me, she didn't react, which meant the disguise was working. I steeled myself, took a flute of champagne from a passing waiter, and then approached the stage area. The host for the evening, a well-known talk show personality, stepped up to the microphone. She welcomed everyone, thanked the sponsors, which included my sister's company, and talked about how thrilled they were to have an array of authors in attendance. Then she said, "But one writer in particular has captured the world's attention with a story of heartbreak, betrayal, and triumphant revenge. This novel soared to bestseller lists in record time, and the mystery of the author's true identity has only fueled the public's fascination. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the incomparable Nova Frost." Applause filled the room, but there was a collective hush of curiosity. Two people craned their necks, whispering. I took a deep breath and climbed a few steps to the microphone. My father stood near the front, arms folded, trying to see who would appear. My sister arched an eye as if to say, "Let's see who this big shot is." Standing before that sea of onlookers, I felt a rush of adrenaline. For a split second I was terrified, but then I caught sight of my reflection in a mirrored panel, and I saw a woman who had crawled through the mud and come out shining. I saw the woman who'd been belittled, called a failure, evicted, sabotaged, and now I was the star of the night. I leaned into the microphone and said, "Some of you know me by a pen name, but a few in this crowd once knew me in a much less glamorous way. My name is Mary, and I am Nova Frost." My father's jaw literally dropped, and I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. My sister's face paled. A ripple of murmurs ran through the guests. Cameras started flashing. I could see my father shifting uncomfortably, while my sister set her glass down with a trembling hand, looking like she wanted to bolt. I continued, my voice steady. "I wrote a story about betrayal, about a woman who was cruelly cast aside by the very people who should have supported her, but she found her strength in the shadows. She bided her time, and in the end she found a way to stand on top of the world that tried to bury her. And tonight I want to thank the real inspirations for that story, my father and my sister, who are here." I turned to them. "Thank you for teaching me just how brutal and vicious people can be, because without your heartless actions I might never have tapped into the raw rage and pain that fueled my success. There were gasps in the audience. I saw reporters scribbling notes. A few cameras swung toward my father and sister, who looked like deer caught in headlights. My father's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. My sister's eyes went wide, her cheeks turning red as she realized all eyes were on her. She glanced around, desperate for an escape, but the cameras cornered her like a pack of wolves. I let the tension build for a moment, then addressed the crowd again. When I was kicked out of my family home after losing my job, something they orchestrated behind the scenes, I was left with nothing but the clothes on my back and my determination to prove them wrong. Well, I did more than prove them wrong. I channeled every ounce of humiliation into my writing. This story is what came out of those ashes, and here we are celebrating its success. My voice was shaking with emotion, but I didn't stop. But that's not all. You see, I learned that money was their language, so I used some of the profits from my novel to purchase a certain building in town, a building that houses my sister's so-called venture. Yes, that's right, she's been paying rent to me for months without knowing it, and ironically my father helped sign off on some expansions there, never realizing who the real owner was. The audience started murmuring louder. People glanced at my sister, who pressed her lips together as if she might scream or cry or faint. My father's face turned red with fury and shame. He tried to move toward the stage, maybe to shut me up, but a couple of the event staff blocked him, letting me finish. I said, all those times you called me worthless, a failure, a parasite, I hope you choke on them now, because your contempt didn't break me, it made me unstoppable. I turned directly to my father. You once asked me what good writing could ever do. How about it lands a major movie deal and puts you in the position of answering to me every single month for your precious business interests? How about that? A stunned silence fell over the room, then a wave of applause and shouts rippled through the crowd. Some people cheered for me, others stood there with their mouths hanging open, not quite sure what drama they just witnessed. My sister clasped her hands together, lips trembling, eyes brimming with tears. She tried to stammer something like, "Mary, wait, we can talk about this," but her voice was drowned out by the commotion. I felt a swell of triumph so intense tears burned at the corners of my eyes. This was the moment I dreamed about. My father and sister confronted with their cruelty on a grand stage, cameras flashing, the press hungry for this juicy scandal. They were powerless to spin it, no quick lie to bury it, because the truth was out. I was no longer that broken woman sobbing in the guest room. I was a best-selling author who owned their illusions of power. I didn't want to face more reporters. I just wanted to breathe the night air and feel that glorious sense of closure. My father and sister would spend the rest of the night in damage control, but there was no shutting down the story. By morning, it would be viral. And me? I was free. I caught a cab back to my apartment. Once I was inside, I slumped against the door, feeling exhaustion mingle with euphoria. I let out a shaky laugh. My phone was still buzzing nonstop, but I ignored it. I let myself revel in the moment. I'd done it. I had torn down their facade in front of everyone. After all their cruel stunts, I had turned the tables so decisively it felt like something out of the very novel I'd written. The next day, I was bombarded with interview requests. The publishing house was thrilled. Sales were skyrocketing. My father and sister went silent on social media while tabloids churned out sensational headlines about the mysterious author's public takedown of her own family. I even got a cryptic text from a distant aunt who wrote, "Proud of you, honey." They deserved it. That text warmed my heart more than any public praise. It reminded me I wasn't entirely alone. In the weeks that followed, my sister, Jennifer, tried to contact me multiple times, voicemails, emails, texts, saying she wanted to work something out or that she was sorry. My father never apologized, of course. He doubled down, telling anyone who'd listen that I'd fabricated everything. But it didn't matter. The world had seen enough, and my father's denials fell on deaf ears. As for Jennifer, I refused to answer her. She wanted to salvage her business, which was now overshadowed by this scandal. She was probably terrified I'd evict her, but ironically, I decided not to, at least not right away. I liked the idea of receiving her rent checks every month, a symbolic restitution for years of torment. The power dynamic had flipped, and it was time she sat with that knowledge. One day, I opened my mailbox to find a letter from my father's lawyer. It threatened all sorts of lawsuits for defamation. I just laughed and forwarded it to my own legal team, people I'd hired specifically to handle this nonsense. Then I went back to writing. There was a strange peace in my soul, a calm after the storm, knowing I had claimed my life back on my own terms. For the first time, I felt free of their toxic grip, their opinions, their manipulations, their sabotage. They didn't matter anymore. I was beyond their reach. My second novel, also under the pseudonym Nova Frost, was all about empowerment after betrayal. I dedicated it, ironically, to those who taught me how to fight. It, too, sold remarkably well, riding the wave of publicity from my big reveal. As the months rolled by, I began traveling to speak at empowerment seminars and writer conferences, sharing what I'd learned about turning pain into power. Of course, I omitted the most personal details, but the message was clear: never let anyone define your worth. Fight for your own voice, even if it means standing alone. My father's business started taking hits, partners pulling out, bad press swirling around. I heard from a friend that he was on the verge of bankruptcy. There was a time when I might have felt pity, but now, I just felt a serene sense of justice. What goes around truly does come around. Meanwhile, I quietly thrived. My investments multiplied, and I kept the building where Jennifer's office was located. She kept paying rent on time, never a day late. She probably hoped I wouldn't raise it. Part of me wanted to triple it just to watch her sweat, but I took the high road. The psychological toll of knowing she was paying me was satisfying enough. Eventually, a new development offered me the chance to sell that building for nearly twice its original value. At first, I hesitated because owning it felt like a direct piece of leverage. But then I realized letting it go at a massive profit was an even sweeter victory. It was me showing that I didn't need to cling to them for power. I had grown beyond that. So I sold the property, made a fortune, and poured it into a charity that supported women escaping toxic households. The symbolic circle was complete. I no longer needed to feed on vengeance alone. I had won. But let me be clear, if you think this story ends with my father and sister tearfully apologizing, you'd be wrong. I never got that neat closure from them. They never admitted they were wrong, never offered sincere remorse. Maybe it's not in their nature. What I did get was the certainty that I didn't need their validation. Their presence in my life was a poison that I had finally extracted. That's more precious than any apology they could offer. Sometimes, I still ache when I think of what family should be. It's not supposed to be about sabotage and cruelty. But life doesn't always follow a tidy script. So we adapt, we forge our own paths. I turned my pain into a weapon of self-defense and used it to carve out a life that, once upon a time, I didn't dare to dream of. There's a strange kind of peace in that. Here I am, years later, looking out the window of my high-rise condo, sipping tea while I finalize the edits on my fourth novel. I've grown used to seeing my face, or the name Nova Frost, on bestseller lists, even hearing rumors of a major streaming service wanting to adapt my stories for a limited series. It's surreal, but what feels even more surreal is how strong I feel inside. How unbreakable. I still get messages from women and men, too, who say my work gave them the courage to walk away from toxic relationships, to stand up to their bullies, to chase their dreams. And I cherish each one. That's the power of telling your truth, no matter how ugly or painful. It resonates. It sets off sparks in others. Maybe that's the real revenge, using the very pain that tried to destroy me to lift up others. I sometimes wonder if Jennifer reads my new books. If she sees herself in some of the antagonists. Maybe she does. Maybe she hates it. Or maybe she's in denial, telling herself it's all fiction. Regardless, it's not my concern anymore. I live my life on my terms, fueled by the knowledge that I survived the worst they threw at me and still emerged triumphant. For a long time, my father was the looming figure in my nightmares, telling me I wasn't good enough, that I was disposable. Now, he's just a sad ghost of a man, haunted by the knowledge that I'm thriving without him. My sister? Well, she still sends me the occasional, "let's talk," email. But they go unanswered. She lost the privilege of conversation the day she took my livelihood and stomped on my dignity. Sometimes, I play the scene at the gala in my mind, me stepping up to that microphone, exposing them to the world. The hush, the flash of cameras, the stunned expressions, the sudden rush of unstoppable power in my veins. It was my rebirth, the moment I claimed my life fully and completely. If anyone ever asks me, "Do you regret humiliating them so publicly?" I'd say no, because it wasn't about cheap thrills. It was about revealing the truth they tried so hard to deny. It was about showing everyone, myself included, that I was stronger than their lies. And here's the final thing I want to tell anyone who's listening, reading, or watching. You do not have to stay a victim of someone else's cruelty. Sometimes, the best revenge is building yourself into someone they can no longer touch. And sometimes, you need that dramatic, explosive moment to sever the last chains they hold on you. Don't let them shame you for wanting retribution. You have every right to demand justice for how you've been treated. But at the end of the day, after the dust settles and the cameras fade, the greatest gift you can give yourself is peace. Build your empire. Step onto that stage, reveal your truth and watch as the ones who doubted you shrink under the spotlight. And then, when you have all the power in your hands, decide how you want to wield it. I chose to shine a light on them, to let the world see what they'd done. And then I chose to move on. It was enough. I'm telling you this because I want you to know you're not alone. If you're feeling hopeless, betrayed, or torn apart by people who should have protected you, I understand that pain. I lived it, but don't ever think you have to accept it. Plot your escape, stoke that fire inside you. And when the time is right, make your move. They'll never see you coming, and when you finally stand tall, looking down on the wreckage of their arrogance, you'll realize you've reclaimed your power, and there's no going back. That's my story. That's how I went from a broken, humiliated daughter and sister to a silent puppeteer pulling the strings behind the scenes, and then finally to the woman who stepped into the spotlight and claimed her worth in front of them all. If you connect with this journey, share it. Let others know they can do the same. And remember, no matter how deep they bury you in shame, you can always dig your way out. So if this resonates with you, if you felt every moment of rage, betrayal, and triumph, do me a favor. Stand up for yourself right here, right now. Speak out, hit that like button, drop a comment about your own story, or share this with someone who needs it. And most importantly, subscribe to stay connected. Because this isn't the end. It's a beacon for everyone who's ever been crushed by the people they trusted most. Trust me, we can rise together. And our roar will echo far beyond their attempts to silence us. Her hand, chatting animatedly with some potential investors. Neither of them had a clue that I was about to walk into the room, right under their noses, as the star of the evening. I made my way through the crowd, careful to keep my movements slow and deliberate. My heart was racing, but I felt a sense of calm as I reminded myself of how far I'd come. From the broken, humiliated woman in a cheap motel room to this, on the brink of becoming a force they could no longer ignore. Finally, the time came. The lights dimmed, and the stage was set for the big reveal. The host introduced Nova Frost, calling me the mysterious author, who had captivated readers and taken the world by storm with a story of revenge. The applause was deafening as I made my way to the stage. The room went silent when they saw me. The guests weren't sure what to make of the elegant woman in the sleek black gown. My father's face shifted from smugness to confusion and then shock. He locked eyes with me, trying to figure out where he had seen me before. And that's when it happened. His expression morphed into something unrecognizable and his jaw slackened. Patricia's eyes narrowed in disbelief. She took a step forward, as if trying to process what was unfolding. She finally asked the question that had been burning on her tongue. "Nova Frost, is you?" I smiled. The crowd hushed, the tension thick in the air. My voice was steady as I replied, "Yes, Patricia. It's me." My words landed like daggers, and for the first time in years, I felt the power of control. The silence stretched out for what felt like eternity before the room erupted into whispers. My father looked like he had been punched in the stomach. My sister's face flushed with a mixture of rage and humiliation, unable to process the reality that the failure, in her eyes, had built something bigger than she could ever imagine. I savored every second of it, knowing they could no longer control me or my story. The tables had turned. My success, my revenge, had become my ultimate triumph. The rest of the evening went by in a blur. I answered questions with poise, leaving behind the painful memories of what had been. I knew that my journey wasn't over, but I had already taken back my power in the most spectacular way possible. As I left the event later that night, the gleaming city lights felt brighter, more promising. I was finally free. And they were finally going to learn what it meant to mess with someone who had nothing left to lose.